This lecture review video examines the French Revolution. The French Revolution, of course, is one of the most significant events in European and also world history. It is often identified as one of the three great revolutions in world history. The French Revolution being the revolution that toppled the old medieval aristocratic order and created a new society or a meritocracy in which someone could advance in society based on their own hard work and merits rather than where they were born in life. The American Revolution, which established principles of liberty and democracy and balanced government, limited government, or one of the first great republics in world history. And also the Russian Revolution in 1917, which ended the monarchy in Russia and established the first communist state for a large country in world history. There's much debate exactly how to date the French Revolution. It is clear that events were certainly picking up speed in 1789 with the outbreak of violence and the calling of the Estates General in 1789. But the French Revolution goes through many stages. It's difficult to exactly determine and agree upon when it exactly ended. Right here, I'm going to date the conclusion of the French Revolution in 1804 because in that year, Napoleon Bonaparte is crowned Emperor of France. So it is clear that whatever the revolution was about in its beginning had certainly changed by 1804 with the reemergence of a single autocrat ruling over all of France. But there are many that feel that the French Revolution actually continues into the reign of Napoleon and perhaps ends in 1815 with the end of his reign as emperor in the Battle of Waterloo. But there are also many others that believe that the French Revolution may have lost some steam, but indeed carries forward into and throughout the 19th century with a ripple effect impacting subsequent revolutions, not only in France in 1830 and 1848, but also many other European countries as well. The important thing to remember here is that the French Revolution does have a broad, long-lasting, very significant impact on European history. The French Revolution occurs immediately after the other significant revolution of the 18th century, which of course was the American Revolution. The American Revolution, in many ways, was fueled by many of these French Enlightenment ideas that had emerged throughout the 18th century. Ideas regarding the balance of government and the value of republics, religious toleration, the freedom of speech and press and assembly, and the important necessity of creating three branches of government with checks and balances and separation of powers. All of those ideas find their way into the documents that are key to the American Revolution, either the Declaration of Independence or the United States Constitution and its Bill of Rights. Thus, the French Revolution takes place in some ways in the shadow or immediately after the inspiration of what occurs in the American colonies and the establishment of the United States. And so we see a lot of reverence for what the founding fathers had achieved in America, and that inspires many revolutionaries in France in the writing of a new constitution, the toppling of the king, the end of the old aristocratic feudal order that had predominated throughout the Middle Ages, and the beginning of a new society based on opportunity and merit and personal individual achievement. To understand France on the eve of the revolution, we have to understand what is often identified as l'Ancien Régime, or the Old Regime. Old Regime France really stemmed from the medieval period and its remnants of feudalism. There were three estates, or three social classes in France. The first social class was the clergy, or first estate. The second estate was the nobility, aristocracy, and the third estate was everyone else. In Old Regime France, birth is privileged over merit. It is more important into what family you are born and with what title you are born than it is how well educated you are, how hard you work, or what you have achieved on the basis of your own merits. Therefore, there is a rigid caste system in Old Regime France that prohibits people getting ahead in life and rewards those who are often lazy and indulgent simply because of the family in which they were born. As we head to the explosion of the French Revolution in 1789, it is clear that the French monarchy had been corrupt, very indulgent, and had been living a very lavish, expensive, debt ridden lifestyle for a long time. We saw that particularly during the reign of Louis XIV, whose oppressive policies of taxations were used to fund many of Louis's wars, which were very expensive, and also the construction of his lavish palace and the continuance of his lavish lifestyle at the Palace of Versailles. We see a continuance of that type of indulgence and reckless spending and high taxation during the reign of his great grandson, Louis XV. Louis XV was notorious for living an indulgent lifestyle and seeking the satisfaction of all of his whims. He was particularly notable for all of his mistresses, the most famous of which was probably Madame de Pompadour, who exercised broad influence over the king and influenced many state decisions over the king. In fact, at the Palace of Versailles, Louis XV had his own location, often nicknamed the Stag Park, where he kept a house of mistresses that would be ready upon his beck and call. Things get no better and certainly get worse under the reign of Louis XV's son, Louis XVI. Louis XVI was in many ways ill-bred, immature, definitely indulgent, quite ignorant, and focused on his own concerns rather than the problems afflicting France. There is a dearth of quality, strong leadership in France as we head towards the beginnings of the revolution in 1789. Louis XIV was far more concerned with his toys, and he was fascinated by locks and fancied himself a locksmith. And so he is really concerned with trifling things, even as France is headed towards revolution. What made matters worse for Louis XVI was that he was married to a young Austrian princess who was only 17 years old when she comes to France, and who was Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette is going to be a lightning rod for criticism and revolt. As the revolution breaks out, she is going to be accused of being a spy for her native Austria, and her own indulgent lifestyle is going to be heavily criticized even while people are starving and suffering throughout the country. Thus, with this old regime France, with the king at the top presiding over the three states, it is clear that France is a very rigid society where there's very little opportunity to advance. The king was at the top of the triangle of the social classes of the estates. The first estate immediately beneath the king was the clergy. They only represented half of 1 percentage point of the population, but they controlled 15% of the land. Many of these priests are poor and illiterate, poorly trained. They really don't speak Latin. They really can't deliver the Mass in Latin. There's profound ignorance among the clergy in France on the eve of the Revolution. There's also a rampant policy of simony, which is the purchase of church offices. People are being promoted in the church not because of their godliness or interest in spiritual things, but simply because they have the money to purchase a higher title and become an archbishop or a bishop or cardinal. All of the clergy, even as they live a rather privileged lifestyle, are exempt from taxation. The French church controlled vast amounts of land in France, and yet they are not paying into the national treasury to fund any of the national expenses. They were the first estate. The second estate was the nobility. They represented 2% of the population, but controlled at least 20% of French lands. They held numerous monopolies. They were almost completely exempt from taxation. They, too, are living a very decadent and indulgent lifestyle without putting any money into the national treasury. There are two types of nobles in 18th century France. They were the nobles of the sword. These were nobles who had inherited their wealth and had titles that extended all the way back to the medieval period. And then there are also the nobles of the robe. These were members of the nobility who had purchased their title as a count or as a baron or as a duke, and they sought influential political roles. Beneath the first and second estate, which altogether represented 2.5% of the population, was everyone else. Everyone else was categorized in the third estate. This group composed 97% of the population. There are really two groups within the third estate. An upper group, which was really a middle class, the bourgeoisie, they are sometimes called. They might have been merchants or lawyers or doctors. They might have had some education. They may own a small manufacturing mill. And then beneath them were the lowest people in society. These are the peasants, the remaining serfs, vagrants, people who wander around and are unemployed, prostitutes. There's a tremendous increase in women selling themselves into prostitution, particularly in French cities on the eve of the French Revolution, because their families are starving and they have no other way to earn any money. And also in this lowest of groups within the third estate were the sans-culottes. The sans-culottes were laborers, the working class, who wore long pants. They couldn't afford, neither was it practical, to wear knee breeches, which was common for high society. Therefore, they wore pants that were long pants as laborers. They are going to become some of the most violent but also significant activators of the revolution as it progresses in France. On the backs of the third estate was assigned all the duties of taxation to pay for the decadent lifestyles of all those above them, particularly the king and his family. Therefore, the burden of taxation was heavy with tithes, which was 10% of your income paid to the church, remaining feudal dues, a tax on land, an income tax, a poll tax, the very much hated gabelle, which was a salt tax on salt, mill tax, and also the corvée, which was known as obligatory labor. In other words, you would work for perhaps 5 days a week in your own fields, and then on the sixth day you would have to work for free in the fields of the nobility. Thus, we can see that on the back of the third estate, they are really carrying the other two estates, the clergy and the nobility, through this oppressive form of taxation. For all of these reasons, we can see why there is an explosion of revolution that finally came in 1789. In many ways, it's a surprise that the revolution didn't break out before this, because we're looking at several hundred years of oppressive taxation and a very rigid social class system, very incompetent and indulgent kings and queens, and a population that is growing in resentment year after year. Thus, among the many causes of the French Revolution, we can identify the old order or old regime estate distinctions, the ideas of the Enlightenment, which were proliferating in the salons of Paris and other French cities, promoting the ideas that were very critical of the monarchy and also the church, and promoted the idea of the separation of powers and the removal of state influence from the economy. The failure of reform in the past, the inspiration of the American Revolution, the growing financial crisis, including the fact that France is on the verge of bankruptcy in the 1780s, a very decadent, indulgent, corrupt monarchy, oppressive form of taxation, and then a series of very harsh winters and therefore bad harvests that create an even greater crisis regarding the price of bread and people's welfare in the 1780s, which leads to a profound famine and a sharp increase in prices, particularly the price of bread. Now, the French Revolution is an enormously complex event, and it has been written about extensively and studied, and it goes through a series of cycles or stages of the revolution. We might identify these stages as beginning first as a period of monarchy, which was the historic form of government in France, and then progressing, particularly in 1789, with a period of revolt. We see revolt on the government level with the tennis court oath of the Estates General, but also revolt in the streets with large crowds storming the Bastille on July 14, 1789. We see mob action in the streets. So the level of revolt and revolution is taking place not only at the government level, but also in the streets of Paris. Then perhaps the French Revolution proceeds to a stage of reform in which the National Assembly is created and several new constitutions are written. The Declaration of the Rights of Man is passed by the Estates General. They limit the power of the king. And it seems like they are gradually pulling apart that old feudal order of the old regime. But then the revolution enters, as many revolutions do, a very violent stage, which we can call the Reign of Terror or even the Great Terror, in which people are often accused of being the enemies of the revolution, and a small cabal, a small group gains control of the motor of the revolution, known as the Committee of Public Safety, and under the leadership of Maximilien Robespierre, oversees the execution of tens of thousands victims of those who are critical of the revolution or those who are simply accused of being counter-revolutionary. Eventually, there's a reactionary period against the Reign of Terror. Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety are toppled, and we see the emergence of a directory, including something resembling an executive branch and also a legislative branch, with the executive branch being presided over by 5 directors. But the failure of the directory to achieve reform is destroyed in the coup de Brumaire, led by the young artillery captain Napoleon Bonaparte, who, with 2 other members of the government, create the consulate, which harken back to classical Rome, in which we have 3 consuls, Napoleon Bonaparte being the first consul, and 4 bodies of legislators. Of course, the consulate was doomed to failure from the very beginning because it was inefficient and it was really overshadowed by the enormous influence and power of the first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte, and therefore in 1804, he is crowned Emperor of all of France and creates the first empire in French history. So therefore, we can see in the French Revolution this series of stages that in the end we return to a single autocrat overseeing the entire country. We can now proceed to examine each of these stages in a little bit more detail. In 1789, the crisis has become so acute and so severe that the king is forced to do something that he hadn't done in a long time. The king is forced in 1789 to call a meeting of the Estates General. This is the traditional French parliament in which representatives of each of the estates would come together as delegates and pass laws subject to the approval of the king. The Estates General had not been called since 1614. It had been a long time. Of course, Louis XIV and his successors really had no interest in sharing power with any type of parliamentary body. But now the financial crisis is so acute that France is bankrupt because of its poor taxation policy and its lavish spending and the inability of the government to gain sufficient revenue to pay its expenses. The king is forced to call the Estates General together in 1789 to meet the financial crisis. Now, as the Estates General meet in the village of Versailles and come together, the usual procedure, what had happened to the Estates General, is that the first estate and the second estate would always outvote the third estate. They would vote by block. The first estate would get a vote, the second estate would get a vote, and the third estate would get a vote. Well, needless to say, any measure that was introduced to the body in which they would propose the idea of lowering taxes usually would get outvoted by the first and second estate, overwhelming the vote of the third estate. However, that changes in 1789 because out of great frustration, members of the third estate walk out of the assembly hall and they gather on what was a racquetball court, but is later called designated tennis court, and take the tennis court oath. These are members of the third estate who take an oath and promise to each other that they will not stop meeting until they write a new constitution for France, that they create a new national assembly, and in which the third estate will exercise more power. Thus, the tennis court oath in this room is very significant in the fact that now the third estate is really seizing control of the revolution. They will create a new parliamentary body which will be much more representative of the population of France, and it is clear that members of the third estate will really have more influence over the future of the government than the first and second estate. Just about at the same time that these events are occurring on the level of the government, violence gets out of control, particularly in the streets of Paris. And on July 14, 1789, large crowds stormed the royal prison of the Bastille, ostensibly under the excuse of liberating prisoners of the king. Now, there are actually very few royal prisoners held in the Bastille in July of 1789. But what is more significant is that the mob attacks this old medieval fortress, does liberate those prisoners, but what's much more significant is they seize weapons, rifles, gunpowder, and also some cannons. What is the real significance of the storming of the Bastille is that the crowds are attacking a royal institution, a symbol of the king. They also find the governor of the prison, cut off his head and stick it on a pike and march it around. They also proceed to pull apart the Bastille brick by brick as a symbol of their rage against royalty. So the violence of the storming of the Bastille, and particularly the execution of the guards and the governor there, really represent a popular outbreak of violence against a traditional royal institution. It is clear the revolution, at least on the level of the street, is starting to get out of control. Meanwhile, as a consequence of the tennis court oath, a new representative parliament is formed known as the National Assembly. There are still representatives from the clergy and the nobility here, but it is clear the third estate is really the motor that is motivating the revolution to move along. One of the first documents that the National Assembly passes, particularly under the influence of the Marquis de Lafayette, is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. It is similar to the Declaration of Independence, or the United States Constitution and Bill of Rights. It affirms the right to freedom of speech and press and religion and assembly, and certainly values the importance of merit as someone advancing on their own cause. Really what it is a condensed statement of many of those Enlightenment ideas that had been kicked around the salons of Paris for quite some time. The violence that breaks out in the streets of Paris then gradually expands into the countryside. And so we see in the fall, summer and fall of 1789, what becomes known as La Grande Peur, or the Great Fear, in which serfs and peasants, those who are unemployed and vagrants, are attacking landowners and often massacring them in their own houses, stealing food, stealing provisions, and also tools. And they see this as retributive justice against hundreds of years of oppression of the lower classes. We also see it in the streets of Paris with the very famous women of the fish market who march all the way to Versailles outside of Paris and demand to see the king and the queen. These are very strong, determined women who attack guards along the way and actually storm into the palace of Versailles, nearly killing Marie Antoinette. And they demand that the king and the queen return with them to Paris, which, because the guards are overwhelmed at Versailles and the numbers of these women are so great, the king and the queen are indeed forced to return to Paris. And so the traditional lodging place of the king and queen of France at Versailles is now replaced with the Tuileries Palace in the city of Paris itself. The revolutionaries believe that they can watch over the king and the queen more effectively in the palace and keep an eye on them. However, realizing that their situation is becoming more dire and they're gradually losing more influence and certainly have lost control of events in the street and the growing revolution, the king and the queen take a very ill-advised attempt to escape from France. This becomes known as the flight to Varennes in June of 1791. After staying at the Tuileries Palace for a while, they start to move east. Their destination is to get to the Queen's native Austria, and perhaps they'll be able to raise an army with Austrian and Prussian support, then invade their own country of France and put down the revolution. But shortly before the king and the queen actually make it to the border with Austria, they are identified and stopped at the town of Varennes, and they are arrested by Revolutionary Guards. Therefore, under very tight security, they are brought back again to Paris and returned in June of 1791. Very shortly after, they will also be imprisoned. And therefore, any remnants of control or power that the king had over France is very quickly slipping away. We also see a great fear internationally about the growth of the French Revolution. The monarchs of Austria and Prussia come together and issue the Declaration of Pillnitz, in which they declare their support for the now deposed Louis XVI and their willingness to use their own armies against the growing revolution. Austria and Prussia, of course, as well as other monarchies in Europe, are afraid of revolution breaking out in their own countries and the demise of their own thrones. So therefore, as the French Revolution is really tearing France apart, what we see on its borders are efforts by, although poorly coordinated, by the Austrians and the Prussians to invade France and move against the revolution. Therefore, France has to fight internal enemies and is in a state of civil war over the progress of the revolution, but is also resisting foreign invasion. The danger for those that opposed the revolution, or at least did not support as violent a revolution within France, is that they become accused of being counter-revolutionaries, that they are foreign spies, that they are in league with the Austrians and the Prussians to see the demise of the revolution. Therefore, gradually, France is tearing itself apart in civil war. The civil war is exacerbated particularly through the very vitriolic writings of the newspaper editor Jean-Paul Marat. Marat was the editor of the newspaper L'Ami du Peuple, which was the friend of the people. Marat's solution for everything in France was more bloodshed and cutting off more heads. And everywhere he looked, in a paranoid vein, he saw counter-revolutionary activity and those who threatened the progress of the revolution. Therefore, Marat and his paper are very inspirational in the sans-culottes conducting the September Massacres in 1792. What we see in France, particularly in its cities, the violence is becoming more acute and occurring on a larger scale, directed not only against targets owned by the king or against the nobility, but also against others. Because what the sans-culottes affect in the September Massacres is to go into French prisons and massacre other members of their own working class, often priests that would not subscribe to the revolution. Bodies are badly cut into pieces and heads are cut off, and there's tremendous number of slaughter within particularly the prisons in Paris in the September Massacres. Among those that realize that Marat's efforts and his language have gotten out of control is Charlotte Corday. Corday, from the north of France, enters into Marat's chambers and indicates that she has a list of additional counter-revolutionaries. Marat allows her to come into his chambers where he is in his bathtub. Marat had spent much time in the sewers of Paris escaping the efforts of the police to arrest him. Therefore, he had developed a horrible skin condition that required him to take medicinal baths. And so as Corday approaches him in his bathtub, she pulls out a small knife and stabs Marat repeatedly, and he dies in his bathtub. Later, Charlotte Corday is executed for her crimes against Marat, and Marat becomes even a saint and a posthumous hero to the leaders of the revolution. Within the mob violence of Paris, we can see the emergence of some political organization in the formation of the Jacobin Club in Paris. The Jacobin Club really represents the emergence of a political party that is going to be very significant in taking control and leadership of the French Revolution. Within the Jacobin Club, which met in a hall, there were radicals calling for more bloodshed and the execution of the king, the establishment of a republic, and the execution of all the enemies of the revolution. There were others that were much more reform-minded and didn't want all the bloodshed in a radical revolution, but simply wanted to reform the government and not even kill the king. Therefore, within the Jacobin Club, there are some significant differences. The radicals sat to the left of the speaker's stand in what resembled stadium seating or this high balcony, and they become nicknamed the Mountain, as if they are on top of a mountain high to the left of the speaker's stand. These are the radicals of the Jacobins. They're calling for more bloodshed, a continuance of the revolution, to kill the king, the establishment of a republic, and most violent means necessary. To the right of the speaker's stand were the Girondins. The Girondins were much more moderate, much more conservative. They sought reform of France. They did not want to kill the king, but they believed his power needed to be limited, and they opposed all the bloodshed occurring with the revolution. Those that sometimes voted with the Mountain, sometimes voted with the Girondins, were known as the moderates, or in the middle, and they are known as being in the marsh, as if they're in these lower areas, and they would chirp like frogs, claim the members of the Mountain. And so therefore we see divisions emerging regarding what exactly needs to occur with the French Revolution and where the revolution needs to go from here. The Jacobin Club is, of course, also very significant for the history of national politics in all countries, because this is where we get our famous distinctions of the left, the middle, and the right. The left always meaning much more radical solutions for whatever the political, economic, or social issue is, and the right meaning much more conservative. Those designations of left being liberal and right being conservative come out of the meetings of the Jacobin Club during the French Revolution. Eventually, forces of the left or of the Mountain in the Jacobin Club overwhelmed those more conservative and moderate voices, and they are the ones that really gain control and leadership of the French Revolution, particularly in the formation of the Committee of Public Safety. The Committee of Public Safety was designed ostensibly to protect the revolution and protect its supporters, but of course it is going to become the organ of government most responsible for the execution of so many people and be very vindictive in its prosecution of its policies. An important early member of the Jacobin Club and also the Committee of Public Safety was Georges Danton, a significant leader in the Paris Commune in the city itself. Danton was a strong believer in the importance of more executions and a radical revolution. His famous saying was audace, audace, toujours audace, which means boldness, boldness, ever more boldness, by which he meant the execution of more individuals. But gradually, not only do we see a fragmentation in the leadership of the revolution between the Mountain and the Girondins, but we also see divisions within the radicals themselves. And eventually Danton himself is deposed, removed from his position of power, and is suspected to be an enemy of the revolution and is sent to the guillotine himself. Some of Danton's last words were, "My only regret is that I precede that rat Robespierre to my death." Thus, the Committee of Public Safety is left in charge by some of the most radical figures of the revolution. This includes Louis Saint-Just, but also Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre was known as the Incorruptible. He earned this nickname because supposedly he could not be bribed, and he was so loyal and so faithful to the revolution that he could not be bribed and could not be turned aside from his commitment to the revolution. Robespierre was a lawyer, and he had actually met the king before and delivered a Latin soliloquy before the king, in which the king seemed to pay no heed. And gradually Robespierre, who actually had an aversion to bloodshed, becomes the architect of the most dangerous and violent stage of the French Revolution, known as the Reign of Terror. This is going to be a stage of the revolution that will last from September of 1793 all the way to the following summer in 1794, in which the guillotine in Paris goes up and down every day and night, killing thousands of victims throughout the city and also throughout France. The guillotine was an invention of Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin. He was the personal doctor of Louis XVI. Louis XVI had witnessed a very brutal execution in which a criminal had been drawn and quartered, had his legs and arms pulled from his torso. It was a horrific scene, and therefore Louis XVI, in a great bit of irony, commissioned his doctor to discover and invent a much more humane, quick, perhaps painless form of execution. And so Guillotin comes up with the invention of the guillotine. Now, Guillotin himself, ironically, was not a supporter of the death penalty and hated the fact that his execution device will forever after receive his name. But nevertheless, there were several guillotines throughout France operating during the French Revolution, but the most famous was set up at the Place de la Concorde on this site in Paris, on the banks of the Seine. And this is where literally tens of thousands of victims were executed in the city of Paris. And so during the Reign of Terror, we see a total number of death sentences at 16,594. Death sentences just in Paris were over 2,000. Many others died from suicide, starvation, or the growing war. The revolutionaries always advertised the Reign of Terror as being directed against the nobility, and that the revolutionaries were targeting aristocratic figures who had persecuted the common people or the members of the Third Estate for so long. In reality, a close examination of the victims of the French Revolution indicates that only 8% of its victims were from the nobility. The vast majority, 60%, were from the peasants and working class. So really, the revolutionaries are killing their own. And 42% of these death sentences occurred in what was known as the pacification of the Vendée, or the Vendée Revolt, in which members of this western area of France were deemed counter-revolutionaries. And so what we see in the Vendée are mass drownings in which thousands of people are loaded onto barges and then sent out into the lake, and then they drown the barges, and these people drown in the river, or summary executions. And of course, as the Reign of Terror progresses, its most famous victim is the king himself. He is put on trial for treason. He is declared to be guilty, and then he is sent to the guillotine on January 21st, 1793. 6 months later, his wife, Marie Antoinette, will be led as a common milkmaid to the guillotine, and she will be executed on October 16th, 1793. Thus, the monarchy had been ended in France as a result of the French Revolution. Marie Antoinette had an heir to the throne. She had born to her husband. He would have been Louis XVII, and indeed, he lives longer than his parents do in a filthy, rat-ridden prison in Paris under tight guard because he is the heir to the throne. Those that hope to see a resumption of the monarchy, those known as the royalists, see him as their hope. And so in their minds, he reigned as king from 1793 to 1795, but in reality, he never sat on a throne and never had a crown, as he was in prison those years. And then he dies, most likely because of the horrific conditions in his prison, his heart later being preserved. Now, the victims of the Reign of Terror are, of course, immense. You're talking about thousands of victims over the course of the Reign of Terror. So, therefore, Paris establishes 4 large mass graves in which members of victims of the French Revolution are consigned. This includes members of the nobility, but also Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette initially have their bodies thrown into a mass grave. Many of these mass graves later on are exhumed, and their remains of skeletons and skulls are reburied in the catacombs of Paris, where today there are approximately 4 million victims of various crimes and mass graves, particularly from the French Revolution, located in the catacombs of Paris. Also, interesting enough, during the Reign of Terror, the radical revolutionaries break into the traditional burial church of the French monarchy, the Basilica of Saint Denis, and then plunder the tomb of all of the monarchs of France. And these monarchs are removed from the Basilica of Saint Denis, buried into a common grave. Later on, after the revolution, these bodies are removed, but of course it's impossible to identify the bodies of individuals such as Henry IV and Louis XIV, and therefore they are consigned to a mass grave. All of the monarchs and queens in France before the French Revolution in a mass grave behind this wall in the Cathedral of Saint Denis when it's rebuilt. As the radical revolutionaries take control of the revolution, they also institute not only a procedure of mass execution, but also de-Christianization. We can see here the triumph of some of the much more secular and atheistic ideas that philosophes such as the Baron de Holbach had promoted during the Enlightenment of the previous century. In the process of de-Christianization, the Roman Catholic Church is stripped of its influence and power and prestige, and also its cathedrals in France. The Cathedral of Notre Dame itself is turned into a temple of reason. A common Paris prostitute is paraded through the streets of Paris on the back of a donkey, of course, in a mocking, blasphemous measure against the triumphal entry of Christ into Jerusalem. She is led into the Temple of Reason, which was formerly Notre Dame Cathedral, and where she is worshipped and revered as the goddess of reason. Robespierre, as the leader of the Committee of Public Safety, also orchestrates a very bizarre event in the Festival of the Supreme Being in June of 1794. A large papier-mâché mountain was constructed, and Robespierre descends from this papier-mâché mountain in a Roman toga to be celebrated as the embodiment of reason and the triumph of rationalism over theology and superstition. Needless to say, many in Paris feel like Robespierre's influence had now gone too far. And so as a result, shortly after, when Robespierre rises in the National Assembly to issue yet another list of names of those who are enemies of the revolutionary, deemed counter-revolutionary, and need to be executed, he is shouted down in the assembly. They no longer, many of bold members of the National Assembly refuse to let him speak. This occurs in the month of July, or what the revolutionaries had deemed the month of Thermidor. So this is called the Thermidorian Reaction on July 27, 1794, in which Robespierre is toppled from his influence as leader of the Committee of Public Safety. He is imprisoned. There seems to be a rescue attempt the night of his arrest, an effort to release him from the prison, but shooting breaks out, and as a result, Robespierre is shot in the jaw, and with his mandible bone hanging from his face, unable to speak, he is laid on the very table in the town hall of Paris where he had ordered the execution of so many, in excruciating pain in his own blood, and then brought the next day to the guillotine, where he too is beheaded, the same location where he had sent many of his own victims. As a result, we can see with the end of the Reign of Terror a reaction, a conservative reaction, a popular belief that the revolution has gone too far and it has become too violent and it's lost its way. And so we see yet another stage of the revolution with the establishment of the Directory. The Directory was another form of government in an effort to quell rioting in France and also to resolve the cycles of the French Revolution. And so 5 directors served as members of an executive branch to enforce the law, and there were 2 legislative bodies known as the Council of 500 and the Council of Ancients. Now, the Directory proves itself to be quite incompetent and unable to resolve the problems of France, and therefore a young artillery captain Growing in popularity because of his overseas exploits and victories, uses the power of his army to execute the coup of Brumaire. The coup of Brumaire toppled the Directory, overthrew the government, and he, with the influence of others, establishes another government, another stage in the French Revolution, identified as the consulate. In the consulate, Napoleon served as first consul. There was a second and third consul as well. There were also four legislative bodies: the Council of State, the Tribunate, the Legislative Assembly, and the Conservative Senate. Now, of course, this form of government, with four legislative bodies and three executive officers, was enormously inefficient. Very little got done. Napoleon clearly is the star and the individual with most influence, and therefore there's widespread support for him simply to be made emperor and to take the reins of government and resolve all the problems of France, which occurs in 1804, in which Napoleon is crowned in the Cathedral of Notre Dame and also crowns his wife in the cathedral, Josephine, as his empress. Thus, the revolution has come full circle. We've moved away from a single autocrat in Louis XVI, which the revolution was targeting and directed against, and now it has gone through all these stages to return once again to an autocracy with a single individual ruling, with Napoleon Bonaparte as emperor. Therefore, Napoleon is going to reign from 1804 to 1814 as all of Europe is at war. And then after a brief break, he will return again briefly in 1815, restoring his throne again as Emperor of France. Ironically, Napoleon, who achieved such significant power in France, is not even French. He was Corsican. He grew up on the small island of Corsica off the Italian coast. His father was something of a revolutionary and a military commander. And Bonaparte grows up in the climate of all things military and of the local soldiery. He's very fascinated with army tactics from a young age, often as a boy coordinating snowball fights. He would also go to the local army fort where he would trade his lunch for the rations of the soldiers, claiming he had to get used to them eventually. He also attended Brienne Military School in France and showed great promise, particularly in his theories about artillery and the movement of armies. Napoleon gains initial fame during the course of the revolution by using his artillery to rout some forces of royalists who were threatening the National Convention in 1795. And then as France is tearing itself apart in these various stages of the revolution, Napoleon continues numerous military campaigns, particularly in the Italian Alps and across the Italian peninsula. This Italian campaign, in which Napoleon is often outnumbered by Austrian forces, in which he succeeds in achieving one victory after another, really catapults Napoleon's fame throughout France. As France is looking for a hero and someone to stabilize their country, they see in this artillery captain and his successful victories on the battlefield as perhaps the individual who can lead their country. Napoleon continues his military exploits and victories into a campaign in North Africa and particularly in Egypt, and at the Battle of the Pyramids destroys the local Egyptian army and subduing Egypt as a territory of the Empire of France. Napoleon had an appreciation for the finer things of life, including science and technology and the arts and architecture. And during his campaign to Egypt, he brought a number of archaeologists and scientists and historians with him, and they're instrumental in digging up many artifacts in Egypt and returning them to museums in Paris, including the very famous Rosetta Stone, in which for the first time it served as a key for understanding and reading of Egyptian hieroglyphics. While Napoleon is in Egypt and his fleet is anchored off the coast of Alexandria, the British take the advantage of moving into the bay with airships and destroying Napoleon's fleet at Abu Qir Bay. As a result, Napoleon has no French fleet. He is going to be at a loss through many of his military campaigns to match the success and the power of the British on the high seas. The British are aided in their command of the high seas with Admiral Horatio Nelson, who successfully destroys the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, crippling Napoleon's efforts to control the seas. And as a result, after this, Napoleon does return to Paris, and this is when he executes the coup de Brumaire, dissolving the legislative branches, declares himself first consul, and then in 1804 becomes Emperor of France. After becoming emperor, all of Europe launches into war in a series of battles. Napoleon is very effective, of course, on the battlefield. And as a result, he achieves some of his greatest victories, particularly at the Battle of Jena, in which he defeats the Prussian army, the Battle of Austerlitz, in which he defeats the Austrian army, and also defeats the Austrians again at the Battle of Marengo. At the Battle of Trafalgar, however, he meets his traditional enemy in the British. The British had launched a large fleet against the combined French and Spanish fleet off the Spanish coast at the Cape of Trafalgar. And in the Battle of Trafalgar, Admiral Horatio Nelson is able to pull off the very successful naval maneuver of crossing the T, in which they are able to deliver full broadsides against the French fleet off the coast of Trafalgar. This is an enormous naval victory, an enormous moment of nationalism for the British, and represents a huge defeat for Napoleon and the French fleet, even though Nelson himself is killed in the Battle of Trafalgar. Napoleon certainly had a knack for success on the battlefield, but he is also very much a capable administrator. And he had a great vision for France and what France would look like after the French Revolution. He demonstrated a lot of success in revamping the law code, establishing the Napoleonic Code in 1804. What the Napoleonic Code really did was update the legal code in France, got rid of a lot of medieval requirements and medieval laws and often contradictory laws, really made France much more unified than it had been before. And what he does with the Napoleonic Code is really put into law, codifies a lot of the ideas in the Enlightenment, including equality before the law. France becomes a meritocracy rather than a society based on simply where you were born. He also encourages religious toleration, in which Huguenots were able to worship as they please. Also, Roman Catholic priests were restored, and also Jews were allowed to worship as they please. He abolishes the remnants of feudalism, creates a uniform legal system, although women in France actually enjoy fewer rights under the Napoleonic Code than they had before. Napoleon also contracts a very famous agreement with the Pope. All agreements with the Pope between a monarch and a Pope are often known as concordats, and so the Concordat of 1801, in which the Pope acknowledged the French Revolution and the ascendancy of Napoleon as Emperor of France, and Roman Catholicism on Napoleon's part was recognized as the majority religion of most French citizens. The state gained the right to nominate and pay bishops, but the Pope could often remove them. So it's an agreement to really restore the Roman Catholic Church to its traditional influence over French society after the more radical policy of de-Christianization. Whereas Napoleon enjoyed great success on the battlefield and a measure of success in statecraft, in crafting a new government for France, he did not enjoy so much success in his personal life. Napoleon had married a widow named Josephine de Beauharnais in 1804, who became his empress until 1810. But while Napoleon, her husband, was off on many military campaigns, Josephine is enormously and famously very unfaithful to Napoleon, conducting numerous affairs while her husband was away. Napoleon wrote several letters pleading with her to be faithful to him and expressed and poured out his heart and his true love for his wife. Those letters are captured by the British and published in London newspapers. And as a result, finally in 1810, Josephine is divorced by the emperor, and he takes a second wife, an Austrian princess, Marie Louise Habsburg, who really was a young girl, quite unacquainted with the enormity of the task before her as being wife of Napoleon. But she does give birth to an heir for Napoleon, who is known as the King of Rome. He will never come to the throne, however, actually dying as a young man. With all of Europe at war, and all of Europe particularly ganging up against Napoleon, Napoleon does his very best to keep his enemies at bay, often by placing members of his own family as monarchs throughout Europe. Thus, we see the King of Holland, the King of Westphalia, the King of Spain, the Viceroy of Italy were all siblings or son-in-laws or cousins of Napoleon in an effort to control the continent of Europe. However, Napoleon's army is always a threat, particularly by the British, and under the command of the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, Wellington launches a very destructive and effective campaign against Spain and Portugal in order to liberate these areas from Napoleon's control. This Peninsular War is going to consume many of Napoleon's best troops. It is going to prove a very destructive war, and it's going to mean the beginning of the end for Napoleon. Initially, Napoleon had contracted an alliance of friendship and peace with the Russian Tsar, Tsar Alexander I. But sensing that the fortunes of Napoleon were turning, the Tsar had broken that peace treaty. As a result, Napoleon felt that he needed to punish and subdue Russia, and therefore launched a massive invasion of Russia in 1812, meeting the forces of the Russian army at Borodino outside of Paris in 1812. This army assembled for his invasion of Russia became known as the Grande Armée, because of its enormous size. Almost 700,000 soldiers composed Napoleon's army when he invaded Russia in 1812. Primarily, most of them were Frenchmen, but of course there are many other representatives from other nations that Napoleon had conquered throughout Europe. And so with this grand army, he launches a tremendous invasion of Russia, meeting the Russian army at Borodino and defeating them. But the Russians are very cagey in their efforts to fight against Napoleon, frequently conducting ambushes and attacks and then quickly retreating, often relying on scorched earth policy, which is destroying supplies, particularly cattle and fields, so that an invading army cannot live off the land and runs out of provisions, and also uses its own military forces, and then, of course, the significance of the weather. Now, Napoleon does actually make it all the way to Moscow. He actually does occupy Moscow. This is something that Charles XII wasn't able to do in his war against Peter the Great in the early 1700s, and is something that Adolf Hitler will not achieve in his invasion of Russia in the 1940s. But Napoleon actually does take Moscow. However, upon his arrival in Moscow, he does not find the food and fodder that he needs for his men and soldiers that he was anticipating. In fact, it would seem that the Russians themselves set fire to much of the city of Moscow, so a large portion of the old city is burned. And thus, Napoleon, with no Tsar present to sign a peace treaty, no food or fodder for his men, and the city burning, Napoleon is forced in the dead of winter to turn around and retreat all the way back to France. As a result, this is one of the coldest winters in Russian history, with heavy snowfall, and Napoleon's losses are enormous. Napoleon is harassed at every turn by the Russian army, and bitterly cold temperatures that drop 10, 20, 30, and 40 degrees below zero, with heavy snowfall, blinding snowstorms, which freeze horses wherever they stood. There are incidents of cannibalism among the French army, of them actually eating their comrades, their dead comrades, for something to eat on their retreat from Russia. And as this pictograph shows, we can see the enormous size of Napoleon's army that enters Russia in 1812, and then how that army was significantly diminished through defections and the end of a soldier's term of service, and also starvation, and also being killed by the Russian army, and famine, and all of these factors led to a huge disaster. So Napoleon enters Russia with somewhere between 5 and 600,000 soldiers. He will leave Russia with only 50,000 men. As a result, he returns to Paris, where he is, of course, enormously depressed and defeated. He attempts to commit suicide by drinking some poison. That poison turns out to be old and therefore has lost its potency, and it only makes Napoleon sick, but does not kill him. He abdicates the throne on April 4th, 1814. As a result, as the invading armies are coming into Paris itself, these armies restore Louis XVI's brother to the throne, who becomes Louis XVIII. Napoleon himself is arrested, and he's taken under the command of a British commissioner and sent into exile on the small island of Elba off the Italian coast. While at Elba, he had a small garrison and was supposed to be under British guard. But of course, he hears reports of growing discontent in France with the rulership of Louis XVIII, and really significantly an admission that the French Revolution had failed and a king had been returned to the throne. And so when the British commissioner departs the island briefly, Napoleon and some men hijack a ship and are able to sail back to the French coast. Napoleon follows a trajectory marching through the French Alps that begins an odyssey known as the 100 Days. This is Napoleon's last bid for power. It is going to last approximately 100 days, in which Napoleon endeavors to restore his control over the Empire of France and once again defeat his enemies, the combined forces of the European armies. And so as Napoleon marches through the French Alps, the king, Louis XVIII, sends royal troops to go arrest him and shoot him. But yet when these royal troops are sent out and finally meet Napoleon, Napoleon walks forward unarmed, bares his breast, rips open his shirt, and asks, "Will you shoot your emperor?" The royal troops are overwhelmed and immediately join his ranks with tears and hugs, and gradually Napoleon's forces are swelling and growing in numbers as he moves towards Paris, and the forces that support the king are gradually diminished. Therefore, the king is forced to give up his throne once again, and Napoleon now takes command in Paris. He quickly raises another army, believing he needs to march on the other European allies before they can get assembled. Therefore, launching this large army of some of his most committed and experienced men, he moves against a combined Allied force in a small town in Belgium known as Waterloo. There he is met by the combined force of the British under the command of Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, and also the Prussians under the command of Marshal Blucher. The Battle of Waterloo is certainly one of these watershed battles in world history in which so much is pivotal in occurring at that moment. It takes place on one day, June 18th, 1815, on this battlefield. There are going to be many reasons why Napoleon comes within a hair's breadth of victory at Waterloo, but nevertheless is defeated. Among these are the fact that there's a very famous rainstorm a day or two before the Battle of Waterloo, which makes it very slow because of the mud of Napoleon bringing up his artillery quickly. That is going to hamper his efforts to prosecute the battle from the very start. Also, Napoleon is going to be suffering from a very bad case of hemorrhoids, and therefore he is going to be consigned to a seat or consigned to his tent when he could not be out front commanding his troops as he would prefer. Also, of course, is the factor that the British are aided by reinforcements and their allies of the Prussians. But as the battle progresses, it seems that indeed Napoleon is going to win the battle. And towards the latter part of the day, he dispatches his very best troops, known as the Imperial Guard. These are Napoleon's most loyal troops. They had been with him from the beginning, and he had sent them into many victories when the battle was in doubt, and they had secured victory. Their discipline is incredible, and they march directly into the British lines under just absolutely withering fire, but they do not break ranks. They continue to advance, and it looks like they're going to take the field. But the very cagey Wellington knew that the attack of the Imperial Guard was coming, and therefore he had formed his infantry units into squares to meet any type of cavalry threat, and had also hidden some of his very best troops behind a grassy knoll. And as the French Imperial Guard approaches, that that battalion of British troops stand up behind the grassy knoll, surprise the Imperial Guard, and blast a destructive fire into their ranks, finally breaking the backs of the Imperial Guard, forcing them to retreat. Thus, as a result, with the battlefield strewn with the dead, the British, aided with their Prussian allies, are able to secure a victory at Waterloo and once and for all defeat the Emperor Napoleon. Napoleon once again is forced to abdicate his throne and therefore sent into exile again, this time much further away from Europe, down along the South American coast on the island of St. Helena. He will live there under much better guard this time for the remaining 6 years of his life. He will finally die in 1821 with this death mass taken upon his deathbed. There's been much more recent speculation and evidence that Napoleon actually was murdered. He was poisoned by British commissioners. That's still very much in debate. Later on, Napoleon's body, which was buried on the island of St. Helena, will be exhumed and then returned to Paris, where he now lays in state in the Hôtel des Invalides in his very famous sarcophagus. So thus the French Revolution that broke out with so much hope and putting power to the people, we see enters a very radical stage in which it really consumes its own leaders, and the people is designed to help the most. And in the end, France returns to a single form of autocracy with the ascendancy of Napoleon Bonaparte. As we move into the 19th century, we'll see that many of the issues that led to the explosion of the French Revolution and led to its more radical phases are really not resolved in France. And there'll be additional series of revolutions in France and instability, including in 1830 and 1848, and also as late as the 1870s.